So in the last video, we introduced the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We motivated our lesson on why it's important to consider an additional model to the Keynesian cross model that is going to allow us to entertain the possibility of a more diverse set of economic outcomes. And we considered what the axes of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model were, compared and contrasted the framework for the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model with the Keynesian cross model. But in this video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper and start thinking about how aggregate supply relates to the potential GDP and go into a little more detail about how aggregate demand in this model is a little different than the aggregate expenditure in the Keynesian cross model, and think about how it interacts with aggregate supply to reach an economic equilibrium. So the motivation here is relatively similar to that in the previous video, that I want you to be aware of how there are different directions in which the economy can trend, that it's not just those two polar opposites as the Keynesian cross model. I want you to be aware of the different types of improvements which can be made to get the economy on the track that we want it to be, as well as to be able to interpret the predictions of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So aggregate supply is going to refer to the total quantity of output as measured by real GDP that firms will produce and sell in response to different price levels. And so we've thrown out the word aggregate a lot, and I guess I probably should have introduced this a little bit earlier, but aggregate is just going to be the sum. And so when we aggregate counts, when we aggregate quantities, we are going to add them all together. That's all that we're saying here. So we're looking at the supply decisions made by all firms in the economy, and it reflects the total value of all output, whether that is goods or services, which those firms produce. And so this aggregate supply curve, the AS curve, is going to represent how these production decisions respond to overall price levels in the economy. And we're going to think of this line as being curved, that curvature is going to reflect the law of diminishing marginal returns, that while at the beginning, at the lower left-hand area here, we can increase our output, increase the size of our economy as measured by real GDP at relatively little cost of inflation without causing prices in the economy to increase by too much. As you can see here, these first 2 points are probably separated by about 5 units on the price index, and we're able to increase the size of the economy there by about $1,500 billion, so 1.5 trillion. However, when we get over to the steeper part of the aggregate supply curve, we can see that we would only be increasing real GDP here by, boy, it's hard to tell, but maybe $100 billion, and we'd be increasing inflation by, the same amount as we were down below, down here, that we'd still probably have about a 5-unit increase in the price index, but instead of getting a $1,500 billion increase in real GDP, we may only be getting a $150 billion increase in real GDP. So remember, the law of diminishing marginal returns is going to state that holding all else constant, each additional unit of effort or resources that we put into production of one particular output, in this case aggregate output, is going to be less productive than the unit before it. And so that's part of the assumption here for why the short-run aggregate supply curve, and it's important here to note that this is not just aggregate supply, but short-run aggregate supply, is going to be curved up. And so it's also important to note that it is able to cross the potential GDP curve, which we're going to think of as being the long run aggregate supply, in the short run. And so it's going to be possible to have an equilibrium which is to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve in the short run, but that in the long run that's not going to be sustainable. And so there is this difference between the short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. Though I suppose I don't really have to leave you hanging there waiting for further details on those differences. I can tell you what they are right now. So the short run aggregate supply is going to measure the producer's production decisions in response to price levels that obviously the higher the prices in the economy, the more of an incentive there is for them to produce output. But at the same point in time, they may be running into production constraints due to those that law of diminishing marginal returns. On the other hand, the long-run aggregate supply curve is completely independent of price levels. You can see that regardless of what the price level is in the economy, the long-run aggregate supply curve is constant. Now, it doesn't mean that the long-run aggregate supply or potential GDP can't shift, but it's going to shift in response only to our productive capacity, only in response to the technology, capital, or human labor that we have, and not in response to any price signals in the economy. So those are the big differences there. And we also want to think that part of the reason why we can exceed the short run aggregate supply curve can exceed the long run aggregate supply curve in the short run, but not in the long run, is that in the long run, we can't use more resources than we actually have. That in the short run, we can work people overtime. We can exhaust our capital. We can run our machinery to the point that it's depreciating at a faster rate. But if we did that over a long period of time, then we would exhaust our capital. We would unsustainably rely on labor to the point where they may be too exhausted to work in the future. And so if we exceed the long run aggregate supply in the short run, then eventually we shift back to the left to produce within our potential GDP in the long run. So the aggregate demand curve is going to slope down just like the demand curve does in a private goods market, a private goods supply and demand framework. However, it's going to slope downward due to a different reason. That if we think of a supply and demand model with downward sloping demand as being driven by the law of demand, we can't really apply that same logic to this case. Instead, we're going to think that aggregate demand is going to slope downward due to three reasons. That it's going to slope down due to the wealth effect, to the interest rate effect, and the foreign price effect. And all of those are going to be related to our conception of GDP as being measured by the demand side, the consumption side of GDP, where we think of GDP as C plus I plus G minus T plus X minus M, kind of like we did in the Keynesian cross model. And so it's important to note here that this aggregate demand curve is going to be relatively inelastic, that prices aren't going to change our consumption too much, but that once again, there is a negative relationship such that if price levels were to increase, that real GDP would decrease. And so to see why, let's first consider the wealth effect. So the wealth effect is going to imply that when prices are higher, consumers are going to be able to afford less. That if your annual income is $100,000 and now your monthly expenditures, the prices of your monthly expenditures have gone up by $10,000, then you're going to be able to buy fewer goods and services because that's going to be spent on higher prices. And so the wealth effect means that the higher prices are going to drive consumption down, which means that our our GDP as measured by consumption, is going to decrease as well. The interest rate effect means that if all the prices in the economy are increasing and we are including interest rates in those prices, which we are, right? So interest rates are just the price that we pay for money. And if all prices are increasing, then the price of money is increasing as well. Then higher interest rates mean that we're going to have lower levels of business investment and lower large purchases by consumers, right? So by private households. So when interest rates are higher, we're going to think that there's going to be a decrease in the quantity demanded for home mortgages. There's going to be a decrease in the quantity demanded for auto loans or for entrepreneurial loans to start a business. And so when the price level is higher, the interest rates higher, investment and consumption go down, which then causes, once again, the Y to go down. Foreign price effect is going to imply that when prices are higher and the US dollar is stronger, that our imports are going to go up and our exports are going to go down, which means that this term becomes more negative, which is going to decrease our GDP. So you want to be able to connect these dots and think that this price level here measures prices throughout the economy, and that higher prices are going to have negative effects on consumption, on investment, on expenditure, and positive impact on imports relative to exports. So just like in a supply and demand model, where the aggregate demand curve intersects the aggregate supply curve, we're going to have an equilibrium. We're going to have the quantity of aggregate demand equal the quantity of aggregate supply. The value of what is being bought is going to equal the value of what is being spent. The value of what is produced is equal to the value of what is consumed. And so when we think about that equilibrium, we obviously then think that it is stable, and we want to be able to see where the equilibrium price level would be in comparison to that base year price level of 100. So when the equilibrium price level is below 100, that we know that prices may be stable, they may be decreasing, but they're not going to be inflationary unless we're measuring it from a previous equilibrium with an even lower price level. And we know that when this intersection, E here, is in this relatively flat part of the aggregate supply curve, that an increase in aggregate demand would not necessarily be overly inflationary. That's going to increase prices by a little bit, but not significantly. Whereas if equilibrium were to be up here, then an increase in aggregate demand would be inflationary. So in the next video, we're going to discuss this in more depth, and we're going to think about what causes changes in both of these curves, what causes a shift in the aggregate supply curve, what causes a shift in the aggregate demand curve, as well as what the outcomes of those changes would be.